All right, let's talk about something that's, absolutely essential if you have data in the cloud, making sure it's safe. We're going to dive into Azure Backup and see how you can build, well, a multi-layered fortress around your most important digital stuff.
So you've moved your data to Azure. That's a huge step, but it brings up a really important question. Just because it's in the cloud, is it actually safe? I mean, let's be real. Hardware fails. Data centers have problems. And yeah, in some super rare cases, a whole region can go dark. So what's the game plan for that?
Okay, let's start with the most common, smallest scale problem, local failures. We're talking about things that happen inside just one data center. A server rack gives up the ghost, or a single drive fails. This is where your first line of defense comes in. And the tool for this job? It's called locally redundant storage, or LRS for short. I want you to think of this as the strong inner wall of that data fortress we're building. What LRS does is it makes a bunch of copies of your backup data, but, and this is key, it keeps them all inside one single building. This makes it the most wallet-friendly option out there. And here's the magic number, 3. LRS doesn't just make one extra copy. Nope, it creates 3 separate copies of your data right there in that same data center. What that means is if one copy gets zapped by a hardware issue, you've got 2 others just sitting there perfectly fine and ready to go. So the takeaway here is that LRS is your bread and butter protection. It's built specifically to handle those day-to-day localized hardware hiccups. It's a really solid starting point, especially for workloads that aren't super critical or when you're trying to keep costs down. But what if the problem is bigger than just one piece of hardware? What happens when an entire building, what Azure calls an availability zone, goes down? Maybe a power outage, a flood, something like that. Time to look at the next layer of our fortress. And that's exactly where Zone Redundant Storage, or ZRS, comes into play. This is a serious upgrade. With ZRS, Azure takes those copies of your data and spreads them out across different physically separate data centers, all within the same city or region. So if LRS was the inner wall, ZRS is like having 3 separate towers inside your fortress. Now the big win here is you get both resiliency and residency. Your data is totally safe from a single building going offline, but it never actually leaves that geographic region. And that is a huge deal for anyone who has to worry about compliance or data sovereignty rules that say your data has to stay in a specific country. So, to put it simply, ZRS is your shield against a data center level disaster. It makes sure your backups are still there, even if a whole building is out of commission. But what about the absolute worst case scenario? Now we're talking about the big one, the ultimate disaster, a catastrophic event that knocks an entire Azure region with all of its data centers completely off the map. It's not likely, for sure, but for your most important data, you absolutely have to have a plan. Okay, so this brings us to the final, most powerful layer of defense, geo-redundant storage, or GRS. This thing is amazing. It copies your data to a completely separate paired Azure region, often hundreds of miles away for maximum safety. To go back to our analogy, this is like having a second, fully stocked fortress in a totally different kingdom. And this quote from Microsoft really hits the nail on the head. It's all about shared responsibility. See, Azure gives you this incredibly powerful tool for geo-replication, but it's still your job to actually build and test a disaster recovery plan that uses it. They provide the car, but you still have to learn how to drive it. And the feature that lets you turn the key and start that engine is called Cross-Region Restore. This is what opens the gates to that secondary fortress, letting you get to your replicated data when you need it most. And the process is actually pretty straightforward. First, you just flip a switch to enable GRS on your backup vault. That automatically starts copying data to the other region. Then, with Cross-Region Restore, you can see and use those backups. And here's the really cool part. You can start a restore from that secondary region anytime you want, even if there's no disaster. This is perfect for running drills to make sure your recovery plan actually works. So, in a nutshell, GRS is your ultimate answer to a regional catastrophe. It's the backbone of any serious business continuity plan, and it ensures your data can survive even the worst-case region-wide event. All right, we've walked through the 3 main layers of defense, so now let's put it all together. Think of this as your data's toolbox, and we'll figure out which tool is the right one for the job so you can make the best call for your situation. But wait, before we pick a tool, where do our backups actually live? Well, Azure has 2 main kinds of vaults.
You've got recovery services vaults, which are kind of the original classic option for things like virtual machines and SQL servers. Then there are the newer backup vaults, built for more modern stuff like Azure blobs and databases. The key is just to pick the vault type that matches what you're trying to back up. Simple as that.
So here it is, the final breakdown. Which one is right for you? LRS is your go-to, cost-effective choice for basic protection against everyday hardware fails. ZRS is that sweet spot for important apps that need to stay online, but where you don't want the hassle of a cross-region plan. And GRS? Well, that's the top-tier, ultimate insurance policy. It's non-negotiable for your most critical data, where any real downtime just isn't an option.
And that really brings us to the main point of all this. Azure gives you this incredible set of tools to build a fortress around your data, from a simple wall to a whole other castle. So the final question isn't about Azure, it's about you. Is your disaster recovery plan actually ready for the unexpected?